Mailbag edition. Did the Rangers get better or worse? How do the fans feel about the offseason moves, including Reilly Smith? And how is everybody feeling about Jacob Trouba? We are reading all your hot takes for the upcoming season.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1123 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down, the sport stops sporting the way we all want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So figured Friday edition here. Let's have some fun. We're deep into the offseason calendar here that the NHL has. And obviously, things aren't really happening as far as like trades or free agency signing right now, but there's always something to talk about when it comes to the New York Rangers. And I figure this is as good a time as any to dive into the mailbag, see what you guys are feeling, based on what the Rangers have done in the offseason, what you're expecting for this upcoming season, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to start with a handful of questions here, a couple of questions about whether the Rangers got better or worse from the start of last season to the start of this upcoming season. And this is something that is always kind of a hot button topic in the offseason. I started last year because we did an episode where we covered this very topic right before the start of last season. We'll do the same thing for this upcoming season as well. But right before the start of the regular season, we did an episode talking about whether the Rangers got better or worse. I felt going into last year, the Rangers were a better team then than they were the season before for a couple of different reasons. But as it turned out, I was right about that. You do 1,100 and whatever episodes, you'll get a couple of things right on here every once in a while. But the Rangers did improve last year by 7 points. They had 114 points last year. The one that just concluded, as opposed to 107 points the season before that. So they improved by 7 points. They also went from third to first in the Metro, and they, of course, won the President's Trophy with the best record in the NHL. I do think overall that the Rangers are slightly, I'm not going to say extremely better, they are slightly better going into this season than they were the year before. Will that be reflected in their record? We will see. Hopefully, it's reflected more in more postseason success and ultimately being the last team standing and winning the Stanley Cup. But that's just me. I want to hear from you guys on this topic. So going to get to a couple of comments and questions here from the YouTube comment section. We've also got some emails from you guys as well. But we'll start here with Darth Stevo from YouTube. He says, let's be honest, folks. Are we really better than last year? Would you give this team an advantage over this year's Panthers? That's two different things. I said in the last episode that the Rangers are better going into this season than they were the season before. As far as the Panthers, let me just say this. No, I do think in a 7-game series between the Rangers and Panthers, you'd probably still be looking at a situation where the Panthers are the favorite to win. They beat them this past season, and I don't know that the Rangers did enough to kind of tip the scales in their favor, but everybody's beatable. It's a Stanley Cup playoffs. Anything can happen, and I do think those were the two best teams in the Eastern Conference. I do think those will be the two best teams in the Eastern Conference going into this season as well. But let me also just say this, because a lot of people are doing this, not just Ranger fans, just hockey fans in general. A lot of people are just sort of penciling in the Panthers to make it back to the Eastern Conference final. And I can see why. They're a fantastic team. They just won the Stanley Cup. They were in the Stanley Cup final for each of the last two seasons. But again, this is the National Hockey League. There's a very fine line between winning and losing, and that's certainly even more true when it comes to the Stanley Cup playoffs. So as good as the Panthers are, and as much as I think they probably are the favorites to get back at least to the Eastern Conference final, if not farther, I'm not just going to pencil them in. They have a whole season to go through just like everybody else. They've got 2 rounds of the playoffs to get through just like everybody else before they can even get back to the Eastern Conference final. So that's first and foremost. As far as, the Rangers being better this year than last year, yeah, I think so. I kind of went through the list the other day, but to me, Reilly Smith, I know some people have some reservations. You can count me among you. I think there's other players that could have made more sense for the Rangers, but he's a better player than Jack Roslovic. You look at third line center. I do think if Filipino plays and if he stays healthy, big if, but if that happens, he's a better player than Alex Wenberg. Different types of players, of course, but I think Filipino brings a little bit more to the table. You look at six defensemen. I liked Eric Gustafsson more than most Ranger fans did, but I think Zach Jones has more upside and he's ready to go and take the bull by the horns there. And really, the only other position that's changed is you go from Barclay Goodrow to Sam Carrick, which might be a little bit of a downgrade, but it's better use of money, $1 million on Sam Carrick. And that's to say nothing of prospects that are along the way. Guys like Brennan Othman. Othman, of course, debuted last year, but might have a bigger role this year. Will Cooley, you got to figure, is going to be better. Alexis Lafreniere, the sky looks to be the limit for him. We might see somebody like Brett Berard get caught up to the Rangers. So, yeah, absolutely. I do think this is a better team for the Rangers this season than last season. That doesn't guarantee anything. Doesn't mean they'll make it back to the Eastern Conference Final. Doesn't mean they'll make it past that. Doesn't mean they'll have the best record in the league again. But I think on paper, of course, you got to go win games. But on paper, this Ranger team absolutely is better this year than it was going into last year. We got another comment here. This comes from T-Bone on this same subject. The idea of, what the Rangers need and are they better, et cetera, et cetera. This is what T-Bone had to say from YouTube. The greatest player in the world, Connor McDavid, and his highly skilled teammates could not finish off the Panthers. Ask yourself why. Not enough skill? No. Brute strength, tough, cohesive team defense, team speed, and quickness in moving the puck. The courage to sacrifice the body to win battles and penetrate between the circles to get to the net. Smith resolves none of these attributes. He's talking about Reilly Smith, of course. Smith played well in Vegas's Cup win, but he was part of a roster full of warriors. That's extremely significant. Our Rangers are not that. And I disagree again. I feel like the Rangers, they're a much tougher team mentally and physically than they get credit for. I believe, I would have to go back and look at this. They were like 7th or 9th in the NHL, somewhere in that ballpark in terms of hits per game. They also were a team that they were in the top third of the teams in the league in terms of fights per game. They got a lot of guys that'll drop the gloves if they need to. They got a lot of guys that block a ton of shots. I do think, there is something to what you're saying, though. You need guys that can kind of go into the dirty areas of the rink and dig the pucks loose. That's one area where I think the Rangers probably are lacking at least a little bit. Not even necessarily lacking, but lagging behind against a great team like the Florida Panthers. That's kind of their calling card. They're this blue-collar, just grinded out kind of a team. They get into their game very quickly, once a game begins. So, there's certainly room for improvement in those areas, but I don't see the Rangers as a team that can't compete with the Panthers. You look at those games, all 6 of those games are close. Game 1, I know you'll look at that 3-0 Panthers, but that game was 1-0 with like 4 minutes to go. Every game in that series was, I believe, other than that, decided by 1 goal. And every single game in that series either was tied or a 1-goal difference with 4 minutes or less remaining in the game. So the Rangers are right there. They're not as far behind the Panthers as a lot of people would have you think. I think they're capable of beating them. Would they be the underdog on paper? I think they would, but it's not as much of a difference as I think a lot of people would have you believe. So that's where I kind of stand on that. We're going to keep everything rolling in just a second. We're going to switch the mailbag theme to some of the personnel moves that the Rangers made this offseason. And ironically, we're actually going to start with one of the personnel moves that they did not make this offseason. And that was, of course, Jacob Trouba. A lot of people had some really strong opinions with how everything happened there. And we will get to that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you will always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at all the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home those huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Big shout out to the everydayers. Thank you guys for sticking with this podcast throughout every, single day, every moment of the NHL calendar, from the regular season to the postseason, the offseason, and of course, the preseason. Only about a month away here. Big shout out to you guys. You're definitely going to want to stick around. We're going to continue with our special offseason series, best and worst case scenarios, and we're going to shift our focus to our Timmy Panarin in the next episode of that. Definitely looking forward to doing that. But for right now, let's go ahead and keep our attention on the mailbag. A couple of questions and comments that you guys sent in here. So I mentioned a second ago, we're going to talk about personnel moves for the Rangers. And ironically, we're going to start with a move that they did not make. And that was, of course, moving on from Jacob Trouba in one way or another, whether that's waivers, a trade with salary retention, or whatever it might be. Like I said, a lot of people had a lot to say about that. And we're going to start here with Agent Smith from the YouTube comment section. Before trading or waiving Trouba, you need to make sure your replacement is actually equal or better. The window for decent replacements has largely gone. And Mr. Smith here left this comment after free agency had begun. And really, that was when you kind of knew that, okay, this did not happen fast enough. Like Jacob Trouba, when free agency was starting, he was still on the Rangers. And so you guys know how it is. Free agency begins, and it's an absolute sprint. Most of these players sign with a new team fairly quickly, and there's names going off the board, and Jacob Trouba is still here, and that obviously handcuffs the Rangers and limits what they can do. And once that was the case, I think Agent Smith here makes a very good point that, if you don't move on from him in some way or another, then you can't really do a whole lot to improve your team because he does have the $8 million cap hit. And we're at the point now where, honestly, I know some people are still looking for him to be bought. I mean, the buyout window's closed, but, move on from him one way or another, trade him, waive him, whatever you want to do. It's almost pointless now because there's nothing really you can do. Now, next offseason, I think absolutely they will have to move on from Jacob Trouba in one way or another. But for this offseason, even if you were to clear the entire $8 million, I mean, who's left out there? What free agents do you want to bring in where you're going to be spending anywhere near that amount of money? And with Trouba, it's not just about, finding his replacement and making sure these equal or better. You can find somebody kind of in the bargain basement bin. You could sign a defenseman, or you could have done this at the start of free agency for like $2 million a season, $3 million a season. And that's more cost effective than paying Jacob Trouba $8 million a season. So even if it's somebody that's right on par with Jacob Trouba or even a little bit below, I'd rather be paying somebody like that quite a bit less money than the Rangers are paying to Jacob Trouba. So, interesting point there. And not the only person who had an opinion on Jacob Trouba. This one comes to us from Jason on YouTube. Jacob Trouba is rich. $40 million from New York alone. Retire, get a nanny, figure it out. I like Trouba, but he is preventing the team from getting better. I also liked McDonough, Callahan, Buchnevich, and many others. I'll get over it after a few wins. So that comment's a little bit on the chilly side there, but it did make me laugh a little bit, I have to admit. Look, it's a difficult situation. He doesn't want his whole family to be uprooted. I get it. But as I've said before, when we've been talking about Jacob Trouba, I don't see what's so unique about Jacob Trouba's situation. Having a young child, obviously, and wanting to stay where he is. What's different about that than any other player around the NHL that's been traded from this team to that team and had to uproot his family? And it's an unfortunate part of the business. But when you're a professional athlete, if you don't have a full no move clause, then that's what you sign up for. It can happen. And, it's unfortunate that it went down the way that it did. Hopefully the temperature has dropped a little bit. And look, Jacob Trouba at this point, I will be very surprised at this point in the offseason if he's not out there on opening night for the Rangers. And if he is, then hopefully he goes out there and has a great season and leads this team to where they need to go. There's a heck of a redemption story to be written there in a best case scenario. We'll talk about that when we do Jacob Trouba's best and worst case scenarios a little bit later in the offseason. But I understand the sentiments there. We've also, on the topic of Trouba, we have an email here from Andrew who says, "Hey, John, first off, love the podcast and thank you for your thoughts and coverage over the years. You're very welcome. This game is a business and contracts are the name of the game. So in that sense, Trouba's personal life has little to do with the decisions made by any team. However, if the Rangers treat him and his family poorly, the entire league is watching and the chances of signing some of these veterans with families is going to plummet. It's a tough call for jury, and again, the whole league is eagerly watching. Is there any opportunity for Trouba to tear up his $8 million cap hit contract and have him decide to take a hometown discount so that things work out better for him? Of course, Trouba would need to approve it. I'm not sure that's even possible without repercussions, but just a thought. Yes, so you can't do that in the NHL. I know in the NFL, you'll see guys take a hometown discount, quote unquote, and they'll agree to a contract that's restructured where they're making a little bit less money per season than they did in the past. That's a thing in the NFL. Honestly, I don't know if that happens in the NBA. MLB, it doesn't happen. Those contracts are pretty ironclad unless you grossly violate your contract in one way or another. They're pretty ironclad. And the NHL, it's the same deal. And it's probably a good thing that it is that way in the NHL because we've talked about this in the past. The NHL, the salary cap is very tight and it's difficult to make all the moves that you have to make. And, there's some hard decisions facing not just the Rangers, but really any team in the NHL, especially if you're a contending team and you want to make every use of every dollar that you have to stay under the salary cap. But it's good that they don't allow that in the NHL because, again, the salary cap is tight. And that being the case, you would constantly see teams, like if somebody was underperforming a little bit, they'd go to this player, they'd go to that player, looking for them to take a pay cut. Even in cases where maybe guys aren't underperforming and you're just trying to save a little bit of money, you would have teams doing that constantly, leaning on this player, leaning on that player, trying to get them to take less money. So it's probably for the better. And no, Jacob Trouba cannot agree to less money to stay with the Rangers. There's one loophole, and this very rarely happens, but there's a situation, it's happened at least once or twice in the past, where a player is bought out by his team, but then ends up re-signing with the same team for less. There was even some talk of maybe trying that with Barclay Goodrow. Obviously, it didn't happen, but that's the only variation of that I can think of. The other point that you made is something that I had not really considered, and it's something that I think is certainly at least worth mentioning here, that, if the Rangers were to treat the Trouba family poorly, maybe another free agent from around the league wouldn't want to go to the Rangers, especially if said free agent, has a young family. It's possible it could have that kind of a repercussion, but I don't know that what the Rangers are doing, and this goes back to something I said a minute ago, I don't know what they're doing with Jacob Trouba or what they try to do with Jacob Trouba really is all that different from how many other teams in the league operate. I mean, I guess it can get the attention of some future free agents, and if you're on the fence between signing with the Rangers or signing with some random team, maybe you go with the random team because of that, the Trouba situation, but I don't think it would have had too big of an effect on anything that the Rangers look to do going forward as it pertains to, luring free agents to come to New York. I don't know that for sure. Maybe it would. Maybe that would rub some players the wrong way and they wouldn't want to sign with the Rangers, but I don't think it would have like a massive, long-standing effect on the Rangers when it comes to sending free agents in the future. This one comes to us from Sean Lewin on YouTube. He says, I'm expecting 20 goals and 50 points for Reilly Smith. Best case scenario is Othman being a Calder contender so Smith can play the third line. Yeah, that's those are numbers that I think are realistic for Smith. I mean, he's somebody that's produced at around that clip for a lot of his career, and I think again when the season begins, he's probably gonna have the first crack at the top line. He'll have the chance to go out there, play with Mika Zibanejad, play with Chris Kreider. As far as the power play, he won't crack the first unit. I certainly don't think, unless they decide to kind of spread the wealth. Half the top players on the top unit, half the top players on the second unit. When it comes to the power play, they could try that, but he'll probably be on the second power play unit. And yeah, 20 goals. I mean, that's doable. 50 points. I think that's doable as well. And I think, back to this best case scenario theme. Yeah, Othman, I mean, never say never when it comes to him contending for the Calder. I don't know that I would go that far, and he's got to make the team first. And, if he doesn't make the team, then he's got to get called up at some point or another. So we'll see how that goes. But Brandon Othman has big time skill. He's a very physical player as well. His biggest issue, or at least, toward the middle of last season, I think it got better in the second half. By all accounts, it did. His biggest issue, though, is his defensive play. It's just not quite up to par. It's not what the Rangers are looking to see from a player at the NHL level. So hopefully he's worked on that. Hopefully he's gotten bigger. And if he does have any, defensive deficiencies right now, then hopefully what he does offensively is enough to, counterbalance that, convince the Rangers that he's worth calling up anyway. You just kind of live with him being an average or slightly below average defensive forward. But yeah, Brandon Othman has that kind of talent. I mean, he's put up just ridiculous numbers pretty much everywhere he's been. He was a little bit more hot and cold in the AHL last season than he was probably in the OHL, but he's a tremendously talented player. And yeah, I mean, in a best case scenario, he is a Calder contender. Maybe he's the guy. Maybe he's the guy. And I mentioned the physicality. I like the idea of Mika and Kreider playing with somebody who is physical. Brandon Othman is that dude. He can do some of the dirty work. I would love to see that. I don't think they'll start the season that way. But if Othman makes the team, And if it doesn't click with Smith on that top line, then I think sooner or later, for sure, he will get a chance. This one comes to us from Chris on YouTube as well. He's also talking about Reilly Smith. Hope they have some chemistry and they have two legit top lines. Yeah, I think we all hope that. And that honestly would be the case. Like, because you can call the Panarin, Trocheck, Lafreniere line the second line all you want, and I refer to them as the second line. That's a top NHL line. It's legitimately one of the absolute best lines in the sport. So if Reilly Smith hits the ground running with Mika and Kreider and they play up to their capabilities, yeah, you've got two top lines there. I don't think that can even be debated. Also, another question here from Johnny Reno. He says, if Lindgren is not re-signed this season, he has to be traded by the deadline. Can't afford to just let him walk. I'd rather have him on the team, but he's injured a lot and can't afford to overpay and give him a long-term deal knowing this. So the first part, I agree with the second part of that. The first part, though, I'm going to have to disagree with you. I don't think that you're in a situation, if you're the Rangers, where you should be looking to trade Ryan Lindgren at the trade deadline. The only way I would consider it is if you got something significant back in return. And when I say something significant, I mean a guy that's in the NHL. He's a big-time player, and he's ready to, play NHL hockey. I'm not trading Ryan Lindgren at the deadline for a draft pick. I'm not trading Ryan Lindgren for a prospect. And it's different now than it was years ago with Chris Kreider, because if you guys remember, about 5 years ago, the Rangers were not a contending team, and they went into the trade deadline. Kreider was in the last year of his contract. At that point, yes, they had to either trade him or re-sign him. They re-signed him. You could not afford to let Kreider leave for nothing. The reason why it's different now is because the Rangers are a contending team. They're a team that has designs of winning the Stanley Cup. And so I'm not going to trade Ryan Lindgren just because I'm afraid of losing him for nothing in the offseason if it makes the team worse. The Rangers are not a team, given how good they've been the last few years, where they should be going into the trade deadline and then coming out of it worse than they were going into it. And trading Ryan Lindgren for a draft pick or a prospect, that would be exactly that. So the only way I would even consider trading Lindgren is if, again, you get somebody significant back in return who's NHL ready, a bona fide NHL player, and somebody that you think can help the team win the Stanley Cup. But I probably wouldn't even look to do that. One more question here on or one more comment rather, on personnel moves for the Rangers. This is also about Ryan Lindgren. This question comes to us, or comment comes to us from Tron. I wouldn't have minded a 3-year deal. Most guys are okay until they hit 30. That way, we have his best years in a Ranger uniform. Yeah, I have similar sentiments there. I said, before Lindgren signed his extension with the Rangers, that I'd be comfortable going up to 4 years. A lot of people, as I mentioned in the past, compare this situation to the Dan Girardi situation. And yes, there are reasons to compare it, but Ryan Lindgren is quite a bit younger than Dan Girardi was. Lindgren's 26. I believe Girardi was 32. Giving Lindgren a 4-year deal to bring him up to, his age 30 season, I would have been comfortable with that. The thing that makes it difficult, though, as we've covered on here, is next year's offseason. That's when, everybody's a free agent and all these guys in-house need a bunch of new contracts. And so that's probably the reason why, among other reasons, Lindgren may not age as well as some other defensemen, but that seems like one of the bigger reasons why the Rangers got him to sign a 1-year deal. Give him a lot of money for 1 year, money that you don't necessarily need to spend in other places right now, and don't overcommit to him, and don't have his contract overlap with Igor, Lafreniere, Keandre Miller, who will all be unrestricted or restricted free agents next offseason. So, all right, going to keep everything rolling. We're going to go ahead and conclude today's episode with a couple of just kind of random questions, and definitely looking forward to doing that. We will get to that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sporting the way we want them to. But FanDuel lets us keep the sports going whenever we want. All we have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime that we're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Want to get to a couple of different, just kind of random questions to wrap up today's episode, and a fun one to end on. So we'll start with Kenny here. This is from YouTube. Kenny from YouTube. Mika has regressed, and his play is not going to get better. We will be lucky if he is the same this year as he was last. This was a comment on my best and worst case scenario episode where we focus in on Mika Zibanejad. So yeah, Mika had a down season by his own lofty standards. And guess what? He still ended up with 26 goals and 46 assists for a total of 72 points, in 81 games. Then he followed it up with 16 points in 16 playoff games. Now, granted, in the playoffs, 13 of his 16 points were assists, but still, point per game in the playoffs, that's nothing to sneeze at. And that's, I think, impressive no matter who you are. On top of that, Mika Zibanejad, key cog in the Ranger power play, key cog in the Ranger penalty kill. Both of those units finished third in the NHL this past season. For what it's worth, they came in 30th place in the Selke Trophy, which of course goes to the best defensive forward in the NHL. And the funny thing is, Kenny isn't wrong here. Technically, Mika Zibanejad did regress because when you look at his stats from the previous couple of seasons, he was always over a point per game. But be that as it may, Mika Zibanejad is still, I think, a big-time center in this league. We talk about, the debate of number one centers and what that means, and we don't have to go too deep into that today. But yeah, I do believe Mika Zibanejad absolutely is a bona fide number one center. When you look at all the different things he does and everything that he brings to the table, and the fact that you can call a 72-point season a down season for Mika Zibanejad, yeah, for sure. I think he's certainly in that mix there. I don't see his play falling off a cliff. I mean, he is just 30 years old. If anything, I would expect his numbers to go back up because when you look at what he's done in the last handful of seasons, this was just a little bit down, but there's nothing here. He had that long stretch where he went a really long time without scoring an even strength goal, but there's nothing here that would suggest to me that, his game is about to fall off a cliff. And I think that for sure, you'll at least get the same version of Mika Zibanejad, if not a better version of Mika Zibanejad. And you can start with, again, his probable new line mate. Reilly Smith, not going to say he's a superstar or anything like that. This is a better right winger than Mika Zibanejad has had in a long time. Probably going back to Frank Vetrano, maybe even going all the way back to Pavel Buchnevich. Time will tell there. But I do think Mika Zibanejad is looking for is likely to have a bounce back season, if we can even call it that. Again, 72 points in 81 games. And not to mention all the work that he does when it comes to special teams. All right, this one comes to us from John, just talking about the season as a whole. I personally truly believe this would be the year. I let myself buy into the hype, the 30 years, the comparisons, hell, even the weird OJ symmetry. Yeah, less said about that, the better. I was at the Stadium Series game. Wow, I let the Rempe madness fool me into thinking this was going to be part of the lore of this cup run. I even called out Winnie for a big moment, and lo and behold, it happened. Thanks for the public acknowledgement. Yeah, let me pause right there. John, I think it was during one of the live chats when one of my episodes was premiering, and he mentioned that Alex Wennberg was going to have a big moment. And I think it was in the next game 3 against the Panthers, where he got that game 3 overtime win. Continues here. Sadly, as you know, that would be the last win of the year and the last real moment for them in the season. Also, the Panthers are better. I was at New York Rangers season overtime win against them with Mika's 6th shootout move, and it was clear to me they were going to be our only legitimate threat. I think we are closer than it feels right now. Also, let's let Florida win it all so they don't come back hungry next year. And then he says he's only half kidding. Yeah, I think Florida winning it is probably better than them not winning it, because I do think at times it's so hard to win a Stanley Cup. Maybe your belly gets a little bit full at that point. Maybe you just don't have quite that same edge the upcoming season. I think that's an interesting point. We saw Tampa Bay go back-to-back, but before that, it had been a really long time since we had back-to-back champions. In fact, I have the so the Penguins in 2016, 2017. So it wasn't that long ago. The most recent one before that, though, you have to go all the way back to 97, 98 with the Red Wings winning it 2 straight seasons. Repeating is very difficult to do, and hopefully, the Rangers are just a little bit hungrier than the Panthers this year, if that is the playoff matchup. But I'll say what I said before in this episode. I'm not willing to just pencil the Panthers. I'm not willing to pencil any team in the history of Stanley Cup hockey, the history of NHL hockey, to make it back to the conference final. Nothing is guaranteed. You have your favorites every year. And if I had to pick a team to come out of, that division and be in the Eastern Conference final, yes, I would pick the Panthers, but by no means am I going to pencil them into it. I think that's just jumping the gun for sure. We have a question from Michael here. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on Laviolette's blind spots if you feel he has any. First off, he was 6 games away from deserving a statue in front of MSG, so I remain a big fan. Me too. But as a coach myself, I know that we have blind spots. Often it's a certain player that for whatever reason, you just can't see in them what everyone else can, for better or for worse. And then Michael goes on to mention Gustafson and Laviolette perhaps trusting him a little bit too much. And then Michael also concludes his email by saying, pro tip, I decided by game 5 in the Eastern Conference Final that I couldn't take McDonough and Ferraro anymore. Highly recommend muting and syncing up the radio broadcast. At least you get Sam. Wish I'd done it sooner. I'll never go back. Yeah, a lot of people have said that that's a good way to go, and I might have to give it a shot this season. My thing there is I feel like I just won't be able to sync up the video with the radio audio. I mean, maybe it's not as difficult as I'm making it out to be, but like when the puck hits the board, I want to hear the puck hit the board. I don't want it to be off by even like a half second or anything like that. But yeah, with McDonough and Ferraro, I think this is at least worth a chance for me to do this upcoming season. Maybe some of you will do that. Maybe some of you have already done that. But as far as Laviolette's blind spots, yeah, I mean, you mentioned Gustafson, and I've said before, I even said it a little bit earlier in today's episode, I like him a little bit more than I think most Ranger fans did, and obviously he's on his way to Detroit now. Zach Jones not getting a playoff game. You know, somebody mentioned, I forget who it was during one of the live chats, that maybe the Rangers could look to go with 11 forwards and 7 defensemen for a certain playoff game. And at first I wasn't really feeling it, but you look at the amount of pressure the Ranger defensemen were under against the Panthers during that playoff series. Maybe you get somebody fresh out there like Zach Jones, somebody that can move the puck a little bit. Jones didn't get a single Stanley Cup playoff game. It was the same 6 defensemen in every single game. I believe, how many games did the Rangers play in the playoffs? Was it 12, 16, I think it was. So Jones didn't get any of those games. As far as other blind spots, you know, I'll focus it on the playoffs because that's when coach decisions are obviously the most important. That's when they're most under a microscope as well. Something that kind of stood out for me was dressing Rempe and then only having him play for like 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Forget which game that was, but it kind of ties into what I was just saying about Zach Jones and maybe going with 11 forwards and 7 defensemen. And look, everybody has an opinion about Matt Rempe, and that's completely fine. Take Matt Rempe's name out of the equation here. If you have any forward of any skill set, of any experience level, and you put him on the ice in a Stanley Cup playoff game for only 2 minutes and 30 seconds or 2 minutes and 40 seconds or whatever it was, then there's no way that guy should be dressing. And again, I don't care if it's Matt Rempe or anybody else. That's a waste of a roster spot for a night. So that one kind of bothered me a little bit. And I think also something else that he did during this playoff run, I feel like he kind of overrated Alex Wennberg a little bit. Wennberg was a nice pickup for the Rangers and certainly played a role. Very good defensive forward, good defensive penalty killer. He was getting way too much ice time by the end of that playoff run. There were nights, this happened more than once, where he was like close to the top of the Ranger leaderboard in time on the ice among forwards. There were a couple of nights where Alex Wennberg got more ice time than Artemi Panarin. And I don't care what's happening in the game. If you're up, if you're down, if you're tied, if you're in overtime, Alex Wennberg cannot be getting more ice time in a playoff game than Artemi Panarin. And then, of course, in game 6, you know, it's desperation time. We've lost 2 in a row. We got to win this game on the road in Florida to keep our season alive. And he puts Alex Wennberg with Mika Zibanejad and Chris Kreider. Didn't really like that as well. And while we're on the subject there, I think never giving Will Cooley a chance with Mika and Kreider may have been a mistake as well. And I know Cooley was a rookie and didn't have a ton of points and everything. But you know what? You gave everybody else a chance. At a certain point, I would have liked to seen, not even just in the playoffs, but even in the regular season, Will Cooley get a little bit longer of a look with Mika and Kreider. Because I think he did, you know, play with them at least a little bit. I think that would have at least been worth a look at some point, playoffs or regular season. This one comes to us from Rand. He's got a couple of points here. We'll focus in on Kakko here. I know you can't teach grit and toughness to all players, but Kakko is a big boy. Yes, he is. Do you see a scenario where he transitions his game to a much more physical presence? Jimmy Vesey came into the league as a dynamic, high-skilled winger, and when that didn't work out, he realized he had to transform himself to be an effective NHL player. Is it within Kakko's makeup to have a similar transformation? Yeah, I think in a certain sense it is. You know, it's a little different because Kakko was the 2nd overall pick and everybody thought he was going to be awesome and set the league on fire and everything. Jimmy Vesey wasn't drafted. I think it was the 3rd round for Vesey. So it's a little different, but then again, Jimmy Vesey did win the Hobie Baker Award as a college player. So he was a, highly thought of offensive player in his own right. Kakko has, in the last 2 seasons, I would say, started to use his size and his strength to his advantage a little bit more than certainly he did when he first came into the league. But I'd love to see him continue to go in that direction and just be a big body guy that's impossible to knock off the puck and that can play a little bit grittier. If he was able to do that, I'm penciling Reilly Smith in with Mika and Kreider. But if Kakko was to add that to his game, I think he could be a good fit on that line. As far as having the makeup, I don't know him personally. It's hard to say for sure. But we have seen him not in a major way, but at least somewhat start to use his size and his strength to his advantage a little bit more in recent seasons. So yeah, I think you might be onto something there. If he were to do that, I think he'd be more of a valuable player to this Ranger team. Is he ever going to be a point per game player? At this point, it doesn't really look that way. Never say never. But yeah, adding that physicality, adding just the willingness to use the body to his advantage a little bit more often. Yeah, I think that would certainly be a good thing for the Rangers. And does he have it in him? Only time is going to tell there, but you got to figure he'll be motivated. He's only on a 1-year contract for this upcoming season, so hopefully he can add that to his game. We've also got an email from Rich here. So Rich, basically, he sent me a link to a story written by Larry Brooks, where Brooks was talking about, Igor Shesterkin's next contract and what that might end up looking like. And Rich and me have kind of gone back and forth over the years. I'm big on having, a big time, top of the line NHL goalie as your starting goalie, as your franchise goalie. Rich seems to think that maybe you can save money there and build a good team around, an average to solid NHL goalie. And you could go either way here. You can make a point for either case. Rich has pointed out that, we saw Stuart Skinner get to within one win of, winning the Stanley Cup with the Oilers. You've also got Adin Hill winning the Stanley Cup with the Knights the year before, not, a heralded goalie at that point in his career. Darcy Kemper with the Avalanche. But when you look at the last 25 years or so, most of the teams that have won the Stanley Cup have, a top-notch goalie. Maybe not like the absolute best in the NHL, but somebody that at least is like top 5, top 6, top 7, somewhere in that ballpark. So I'm still in the camp of wanting a big-time goalie. This question could be a whole episode. I'll save that for you, Rich. We'll do that in a little bit later in the offseason here. We talk a little bit more about Igor Shesterkin's next contract and what it could look like and how much the Rangers should be willing to pay him. Is there a certain ceiling that they shouldn't go past? We'll get into that in greater detail, but it's certainly a concept worth exploring in the future for sure. And then we'll end on this. A question from YouTube Sucks on YouTube. His comment here is talking about the Shoulder Check Showcase, which I attended. It was a charity game. Jonathan Quick played, and Jonathan Quick won the game for his team in the shootout by throwing his stick at Swaggy Pete. And YouTube Sucks said, because Swaggy doesn't deserve to be on the same sheet as Quickie. Can't argue with you there. I do want to find out a little bit more about this Swaggy guy, because he seems like a cool dude and an entertaining, I guess he's like on YouTube or Instagram or something. So I'll have to look into that more, but no arguments there. Anyway, we'll conclude. Again, want to mention the Fantasy League. Secure your spot now if you played last year. Get in line right now if you did not play last year. And sooner or later, the people that didn't play last year, if I don't hear back from you, you will have to give your spots to some new people. We'll set a cutoff date sooner or later. Also, a reminder to send in your best playoff overtime stories from this past season. The Rangers won 4 games in overtime. I want to know who you were with, how you celebrated, how you reacted, what piece of furniture you broke when the Rangers won any of the 4 playoff overtime games that they won this past season. 2 against the Canes, and of course, 2 against the Panthers as well. But that will do it for today, guys. Once again, if you'd like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to the Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.